All right, we are looking at the fifth in the series of the Chronicles of Narnia. Not the fifth written, but the fifth in the series in terms of the chronology once the whole series is established. It was written right after the one we finished last time, Prince Caspian, pretty obviously. And if you recall, we left off with Caspian parting ways with his friends. Let me see here. I'll just read the last lines of Caspian, if I can. And some famous lines here as well. Aslan, speaking to Caspian, says peace, because the Telmarines are whimpering that they're going to go back where they are. And then he addresses Sir Caspian and says, "You, Sir Caspian, might have known that you could be no true king of Narnia unless, like the kings of old, you were a son of Adam and came from the world of Adam's sons. And so you are. Many years ago in that world, in a deep sea of that world, which is called the South Sea, a shipload of pirates were driven by a storm on an island, and there they did as pirates would, killed the natives and took the native women for wives and made palm wine and drank and were drunk and lay in the shade of the palm trees and woke up and quarreled and sometimes killed one another. And in one of those frays, 6 were put to flight by the rest and fled with their women into the center of the island and up a mountain and went, as they thought, into a cave to hide, but it was one of the magical places of that world, one of the chinks or chasms between worlds in old times, but they have grown rarer. This was one of the last, I do not say the last, and so they fell, or rose, or blundered, or dropped right through and found themselves in this world, in the land of Telmar, which was then unpeopled. But why it was unpeopled is a long story. I will not tell it now. And in Telmar, the descendants lived and became a fierce and proud people. And after many generations, there was a famine in Telmar, and they invaded Narnia, which was then in some disorder. But that would be a long story. And conquered it and ruled it. Do you mark all this well, King Caspian? I do indeed, sir, said Caspian. I was wishing that I came of a more noble lineage, thinking of this world and over which he has dominion. But note Aslan's response. You came of the Lord Adam and the Lady Eve, said Aslan, and that is both honor enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth. Be content. So the framing here connects us back to the story at the outset in The Magician's Nephew, the wood between the worlds and all that, the sort of Adam and Eve. But of course, it's now called Adam and Eve, more explicitly Christianized than we'll see in the first work. And Lewis is increasingly doing this, becoming a little bit more explicit in his Christological emphases. As the children get older, the nature of the doctrine that they're presented is more overt. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's a lion on a table or on a stone table. Here in this iteration, we're going to meet Aslan in the form of a lamb, and closer to Christian presentation at that point. And what we're going to find that expression of more clear Christian imagery, symbolism, etc., is characteristic of the progression of the series, and also characteristic, I would say, of Lewis's view of what happens when Christianity confronts the pagan world. It becomes steadily more Christianized in its doctrine, in its images, etc. And it doesn't obviate or get rid of the old ways of seeing it, but it does present it in forms that are typologically clearer. In the same way that we can read the relation of the Old Testament to the New in this fashion, typologically, the New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old. There's the promises, all the signs pointing to a future Redeemer, a king of the people, a reconciliation between God and man, a temple, etc. All of these are fulfilled in the person and through the work of Jesus Christ. A new heaven and a new earth, all of those are prophesied in the Old Testament, fulfilled in the New, with the exception of a few that will only be fulfilled in the second coming. But there's that sort of clarity, and so the New Testament, although it's chronologically later, is actually the lens through which we're to read the Old Testament. Totally contradicts the historical critical method that you learn in seminaries, where the Old, because it comes first, is the source text for the New, which of course it is, and in certain respects, because of course in the time of the New Testament writing, there is no New Testament, and they're referring to their own writings as scripture, for that matter, though when they're talking about the scriptures and how Jesus must act in obedience and in fulfillment of scripture, they're talking about Old Testament scripture. But once he has fulfilled it, he is also the orthodox, and the apostles, for that matter, the apostolic witness, are the orthodox way of reading the Old Testament. And in the same way, it's not exactly the same, but analogously, the later works of Narnia are a clear representation of what Lewis is trying to present to children as they grow older. The myths and legends that they love will get a greater clarity, perspicacity, and completeness as they recognize the story of Christ. And so as the series goes on, and we're now in the fifth, we start to see greater clarity and more explicit Christianity, I would say. And probably in keeping with the nature of the children, we'll see, as we did last time, that two of the children have already parted company from these two, or the narrative. Peter and Susan are no longer going to journey along with us. So we'll begin here, not with Peter and Susan, but rather with Lucy and Edmund, and a third party introduced for the first time, the rather odious individual by the name of Eustace Scrubb, who was named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and first line, and he almost deserved it, says Lewis. And his parents called him Eustace Clarence, and masters called him Scrubb. And again, really delightful little bits of comedy there, because the masters clearly disliked the boy. And his parents, on the other hand, speak to him in way, and he said, I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him, for he had none. And again, it tells you within 3 lines, really, how we are to regard this boy. This is, again, a portal narrative. We'll begin with a portal. They'll go through a portal. I'll get to that in a minute. But it's also a framing. We have a framing of a certain type of character. What we have in the form of Eustace Scrubb is a boy without a chest. He's been educated in a particular fashion. And Lewis will make a great deal about this here, also connected to his parents and his parents' views. So let me just say a little bit about that. In terms of the relations between father and mother and son, it's very egalitarian. He didn't call his father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their house, there was very little furniture and very few clothes on beds, and the windows were always open because it was healthy. Fresh air. So they are very interested in their own health, but they pursue their life through an egalitarian lens, including the relations with their children. Now, Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned on a cart. Now, again, this is the consequence of a certain view of life, which is being taught in school, an abstracted, scientific, just like is portrayed in the Abolition of Man, where you look at things in a detached fashion in terms of factuality, observation, but remove from it any sense of a moral framework, or an aesthetic framework for that matter. And we'll find that he's both morally deficient, he's a boy without a chest, and also he finds any reference to things like beauty and such to be worthy of mockery. He makes it very clear. So there's and the contrast between the two Pevensey children and Eustace could not be more stark. And Lewis is trying to make the same point he's made in the Abolition of Man about a certain type of education and the consequences of it. And in Eustace, he's bringing that back in, and he'll make a great deal of commentary about that. But this is all just setting up the interaction between the two. And to add to this, we learn in the third paragraph that Eustace Clarence disliked his cousins, the four Pevenseys, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. But he was quite glad when he heard that Edmund and Lucy were coming to stay, for deep down inside him, he liked bossing and bullying. And though he was a puny little person who couldn't have stood up even to Lucy, let alone Edmund, in a fight, he knew that there are dozens of ways to give people a bad time if you're in your own home and they are only visitors. In other words, he contradicts hospitality. So he's a very bad boy, very dislikable, looks to take advantage of his own situation, is lacking in any sense of gratitude, any sense of moral conduct, is happy to bully. So we get a very strong portrait of him right away. In a sense, he's a variation on Edmund, as we first encountered him in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Remember, we also said of Edmund, or at least Peter said of Edmund, that he had become this way in the sense of bullying when he went to the state schools, which were taught in an egalitarian fashion. And ironically, and this is Lewis's regular comment, is when we present no distinctions, we have no moral framework, we don't get everybody elevated up, we get some people pushing other people down. So it doesn't uplift everybody by presenting an egalitarian framework. What it does is it gets rid of the framework of virtue and vice, and it then doesn't direct people towards acting well towards one another, treating each other better than they deserve. They treat them equally. And under those auspices, the bully is going to rule because he will not be punished, and the might will make right then. So all of the anti-bullying stuff that you find in schools these days, pushed in the public school system, which they want to eradicate through speech codes and so forth, is utterly contradicted by their refusal to distinguish between virtuous character and vicious character. So they're really pushing against themselves. And the only way they can now try and formulate a virtuous citizenry or a student body is to shut them down. And all that does is make the kids talk behind these teachers' back and find new and worse ways of bullying. They just won't do it in the overt way that they did before. But it doesn't eradicate the problem, because the problem, of course, is human sin. Anyway, but this is how Eustace is portrayed as the unfortunate product of two things. One, progressive parents who are deluded about their own responsibility towards their child. They treat him like an equal. They call him by his name, and he calls them by their given name, as if they were equals. And the public school system, which operates according to the same template. So progressivism and the abolition of man, or the abolition of the moral law at any rate in this case, is fully present in this character. And that's the framing for this. And of course, Edmund and Lucy don't want to come here to their Uncle Harold and Aunt Alberta's place, because they know what it's going to be like. They know that Aunt Alberta and Uncle Harold are, while highly rational, are not very trustworthy as adults, and also that their son is terrible, and they're going to be in constant conflict with him. However, father had got a job lecturing in America for 16 weeks that summer, and mother was to go with him because she hadn't had a real holiday for 10 years. Lewis probably reflecting, although obviously not in any exact way, on how he was treated as a child. His father had to work, his mother had died, he was sent away to school. In this case, not sent away to school, but sent to his uncle and aunts for a holiday, but reflecting on how this happens to children and so forth. And Peter is working hard for an exam, and he is to spend the holidays being coached by old Professor Kirk, something like the Great Knock, I guess, in whose house the four children had wonderful adventures long ago in the war years. Okay, so that's how it begins, and there's an interaction between Eustace and the two children where we get something of the character of Eustace, and we grow to dislike him intensely right from the get-go, and see what we're dealing with, and in a way that might get Lewis criticized, except that everyone recognizes a bully and is probably pretty happy that Lewis deals with him as he does. But the two of them, and here's the aesthetic angle, they go into a bedroom and they find the one thing in the, or at least Lucy and Edmund find the one thing in the house that they actually like, which is an old wedding present. It's a picture of a boat, I think it's behind me, in a frame. And the boat looks like it's moving even. It has, what does it have? How's it presented? Oh, it's jumped all over the place. It was a picture of a ship. There it is. A ship sailing straight towards you. Her prow was gilded and shaped like the head of a dragon with a wide open mouth. She had only one mast and one large square sail, which was a rich purple. The sides of the ship, what you could see of them, where the gilded wings of the dragon ended, were green. She had just run up to the top of one glorious blue wave, and the nearer slope of that wave came towards you with streaks and bubbles on it. She was obviously running fast before a gay wind, listing over a little on her port side. By the way, if you're going to read this story at all, and if you don't know already, and this is in brackets here, you had better get it into your head that the left of a ship, when you're looking ahead, is port and the right is starboard. And there's sunlight and so forth. Now, Susan loves this ship and said why it reminds her of a Narnian ship. Eustace hates the ship, not because it's Narnian, but because it represents something transcendent. It refers to something otherworldly about it, and everything in Eustace Scrubb's being has been taught to despise such things as a bunch of nonsense. And so his view of reality is the way we look at desiccated bugs and pin them to a piece of corkboard or something like that. In other words, it's a very dried way of looking at life, and he sees no beauty in it. And his view of poetics is terrible, and Lucy comments upon this as well. At any rate, it begins, here it's a quarrel over aesthetics, but there's more to it. And in this, Lewis is making a comment, as I say, in the Abolition of Man, he seems to be going after the moral law, but he could have just as easily said, and to some degree he did, or at least he implied it, that the realm of beauty is also something that our contemporaries despise, won't acknowledge. And we can see this in the architecture of our times, which is almost always pathetic, dehumanizing, ugly, gray, and crushing of all sense of human worthiness. It's totalitarian. I'll say more about that in a second, though. But that's how it begins, and they find by looking at the portal, it's actually pulling them into, so this ends up being another portal. Remember when we left off in Prince Caspian, Aslan had said I didn't say there weren't other portals, and this is the one that we meet next. And it is nothing other than a picture, and it's a picture of an Narnian boat, and as they look at it, the picture starts to come into their world. The water starts pouring out of it, and they get pulled into it. So another portal narrative framing for the whole story. That's how he begins it. So he does this with this regularly. So it's the imaginative world encountering the world of our day where the imagination is not honored or revered or connected with anything transcendent or good or beautiful or just, and the attempted critique of our world through that world. I do think there's an apologetic intent there. It's just presented in a different fashion. So I don't think that Lewis's works, by the way, are just these Narnia is straight apologetics, but it has an apologetic effect in keeping with the way that people commonly receive truth, which is through their senses. We're embodied beings, and the philosophers that conduct apologetics without recognition of the importance of our affections are really going against the grain of human nature. Recognized from time immemorial, and Plato probably best presents it in terms of classes of people, types of people in his city. There's the rulers, the judges, however you want to present them, the governors who represent reason, and then there's the spirited element, the chest, the police force, the people that enforce what's there, and then there's the common people who are moved by their passions. And that's the great majority of humanity. And psychologists these days have verified that most people react emotionally to things and are really not capable of having their reason rule over their passions, although they're encouraged through education to do so by the Tao, by their chests leading their passions. But some are more inclined to it than others. The attempt of modern education is to just cut off the head from the chest and the body altogether. Lewis will really present this in his sci-fi trilogy. In the third iteration, we have a great head speaking. In H.G. Wells's fiction, we'll look at that if you're with me next semester, in The First Men in the Moon, he presents the Grand Lunar as having evolved to be this gigantic head with a very minuscule body. And then there are other creatures on the moon, he calls them Selenites, who've evolved to have huge arms and so forth, and all fit for purpose. So that's what evolution does in the minds of the secular humanist H.G. Wells. Lewis is engaging with that understanding of human nature and the association of the intellect with superiority in terms of evolution even, which is murderous, as he would see it. Hence the abolition of man. The conditioners that represent the intellect and the brain despise those other parts of the human community who don't have their attributes, and therefore they dissociate themselves from those people. They don't regard them as having any humanity at all. And that opens up them to eugenics and so forth. But he's drawn here into the picture in the bedroom. They all are, and they find themselves then in Narnia. And not only in Narnia, in a place that we immediately recognize, the boat. The boat that they saw is actually a boat on a sea, and they get dragged up into the boat by none other than Prince Caspian. So the immediate connection between the previous tale and this one, but through a different portal. Now, as far as the boat goes, we can see clear references in this book, both in this image of the water on the painted sea, and also later on in the form of the albatross, which will be a representation of Aslan, to Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Remember, in the Horse and His Boy, Aslan presented himself not only as a lion, but as a little kitty cat. Here he'll represent himself not only as the lamb, but he'll even present himself in terms of an albatross. And any literate reader, and not everyone will have read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, although I think in British schools it's a pretty standard work to read, they would recognize the references here in the albatross to a Christ-type figure. Remember, the albatross is placed around the mariner's neck. They shoot the albatross with a crossbow, gets placed around the mariner's neck. Eventually it falls off into the sea. There's sort of atonement scenes all in a secular fashion. Lewis is alluding to that here. So there's a literary background to the whole tale that Lewis is drawing upon, even though he's not going to say it's Coleridge I'm referring to. This is where he's getting it from at any rate. And so the albatross here will speak even, and clearly with the voice of Aslan later on. And here it's the picture of the boat on the painted sea with which, in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, as it goes on a voyage south, mirroring that of Captain Cook and others as they're going down the cross South America into the South Pacific. He's bringing that to our attention. So it's a long voyage, and the voyage is going where in terms of Caspian. Where is Caspian going, and why is he going? And the answer is he's going to find 7 lords that had been left behind, or rather not left behind, had gone to find individuals, and they themselves had been lost in the process. That had been announced back in the foregoing work, Prince Caspian. I'm going to say a lot more about them in a second here. But that's how it begins, and then they're on a voyage. Now, I mentioned the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. There's another text I need to draw to your attention, of far greater significance to Lewis than the Voyage or the Rime of the Ancient Mariner with respect to a voyage, and that is the story of Brendan and the Voyage of St. Brendan the Abbot. And in referring to that, and I'm going to say a fair bit more about that just to show you that Lewis is really copying that Irish tale of a Catholic saint and his voyages. He is to some degree engaging with the idea of pilgrimage towards paradise, which we see in this book very clearly. At the end of this, we're going out beyond the islands towards Narnia, and Narnia there represents a voyage to heaven. Now, in Brendan's voyage, and I'll say a bit about this. Let me put the image up here. Oops, I didn't want that. I wanted that. This is, I believe, from Iceland, representing the voyage of St. Brendan of Clonfert. By the way, so he's living 484 to 577 AD. One of the 12 Irish monastic saints, one of the 12 apostles of Ireland. By the way, when the Roman Empire collapses and Christianity is threatened with annihilation by the invading Germanic tribes, some of whom are Christians, but the Roman Empire collapses in the 5th century, monks will flee the destruction and set up little outposts in Ireland from which the re-Christianization of Europe will take place. And there's, if you're interested in Celtic Christianity at all, that's the story. So from Ireland, the rest of what is now the United Kingdom becomes Christianized from various outposts in the north, the east, the west, but in and around that. And Lewis is, of course, aware of that whole tradition. And the St. Brendan's voyage is written, having said that, well, the latest or the earliest manuscript we have is written in 900 AD. So it's about 400 years after St. Brendan lived and did his missionary work. There's a tale called The Voyage of St. Brendan, about which we have something like 100 manuscripts scattered around Europe, that will tell the narration, and is plainly a Christian narration now. It's a voyage, but the voyage has a certain purpose. Let me say a little bit about this. Just a synopsis. It begins with 2 saints meeting, St. Brendan and St. Berinthus, and St. Berinthus describes to St. Brendan the promised land for saints. And as he describes this journey, Brendan decides that he's going to go to this island because it's described as a place for those who live a certain lifestyle and embrace the true faith of Christianity. And what he is looking for here is purification. He wants to see God. He wants to escape the sinfulness of this world. It's a pilgrimage. It's a peregrination. He's going away from the sinful world in which he inhabits, and he's trying to go to the promised land himself as a voyage. Now, we can see this happens in Christian practices in terms of pilgrimages to certain places that are given holy status. Here it takes place in terms of a voyage. And some think that St. Brendan goes from Ireland up through the Hebrides and the Faroes to Iceland, and then from there all the way over to Newfoundland. Traveling west, trying to find the promised land of heaven, a place where sin does not reign. It's a sort of a spiritual exercise mapped out by a physical peregrination. Some people think that the first those that found North America first they presented as Vikings, but they don't like to tell that there's a Christian story attached to this as well. And there's some evidence, and there's a Society of St. Brendan that believes that St. Brendan and the Irish monks actually did come to Newfoundland, which if you're a Newfie is probably pretty cool as well. You're thinking, God's own country. But that voyage is told, and Lewis is very aware of this story. And because there are certain features of it that we'll see in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader that are exact parallels to it. So Brendan leaves. First of all, he assembles a certain number of monks, 14, who pray with him in the community to leave and go on the journey. And before they go, they have a 3-day fast, or at 3-day intervals, they fast for 40 nights. And then they set out on the voyage that St. Berinthus had presented to them. Now we're going to see correspondences here between the voyage that is going to be given to the children by none other than the wise old owl, right? And you could probably pull in the Parliament of Fowls in this as well, but I'll not add another layer to this. Because I think Lewis is taking all sorts of different literary influences and just inserting them in his tale. But as they go out, they go towards St. Edna, which is an island, and they build a small boat for the journey, and they go with this. And after a period of 7 years, Brendan and his students travel the seas, and they come across various locations while searching for the promised land. And the first island, or at least one of the first islands that they meet, is unnamed and uninhabited. And one of the companions dies there. After a while, they go on and to the island of Sheep, and after a short stay there, they land on the back of a giant fish by the name of Jusconius, which they believe is an island. Now, we will encounter something like this in the beast that's under the sea that threatens to destroy the Dawn Treader. It's plucked right from this. And they're on the island, they light a fire, and then the island starts revealing its true nature. Right? It goes under, and they're, oh my goodness, this isn't an island, they do this, so that various sorts of parallels. They also go to an island of birds. Does that sound familiar from Voyage of the Dawn Treader? The island, the birds come in great numbers, they eat the food, and they depart, etc. There's an island of Isleby, inhabited by a community of silent monks, and there's the island of strong men. And in some accounts, on that island, the island of strong men, the second of the three additional members of the group leaves it and remains on the island rather than going with them. This exactly happens in Voyage of the Dawn Treader as well. And the third of the extra members is dragged away by demons. We'll just leave that. But they go west, and the voyage then of St. Brendan is a voyage westward from Ireland to Iceland and then onwards westward there. Now, this is the actual voyage of St. Brendan depicted in that narrative. In Lewis's account, they go east on their voyage. It begs the question why he would have them going east rather than going west. It's a commentary of sorts on St. Brendan. Anyway, any ideas why would Lewis have them going east rather than going west? There's no reason he couldn't put them going west. By the way, the voyage westward is a voyage towards death in Christian symbolism. Ode to the West Wind by Percy Shelley is going towards death. Yes? Go ahead. You got anything?
I was thinking we have to do with the sun.
That would be naturalistic. That would be the naturalistic, and that's not going to be guiding Lewis on this. But it rises in the east.
But like that's part of kind of this whole point, like they're sailing to the sun.
Towards the sun. Yeah, it is in this. You're right. He does. But the sun symbolizes something. And remember, if you think about the cosmological framework that we've given here, and the sun represents something that gives light, but the true light is not that light, not the naturalistic light. It's just a symbol of things for Christians. They don't worship the sun. That's Apollo worshippers, as in the physical body. That's the center of the solar system. It's because in the East, at least in Western churches, that's where Jerusalem is. And churches are set up, at least in the Anglo-Catholic tradition, they actually have to be oriented. They don't just build them on a certain plot of land. They direct them so that the altar is facing Jerusalem. They have to be directed that way. And from the west, where Lewis is, that's always east. I think that's the reason. He's, again, giving a sort of an homage to Western Christianity. And as I say, this is not going to work where you're on the east side of Jerusalem. They would have to be voyaging west. The point is they're voyaging towards the place where heaven and earth meet in that city. Note that even in the Catholic tradition, they're not orientated towards Rome. The churches are not built to go towards Rome. They're pointing towards Jerusalem. And I think, I'm guessing that's the reason, because he doesn't say it. It's odd that in St. Brendan's voyage, they're going westward, and here they're going eastward. Well, again, that's a spiritual interpretation of what they're doing in St. Brendan anyway. Yes, they're going towards death, but in that death is their life. And here in the death of Christ is their life. Maybe it's a Protestant take on it. I have no idea. I think that would be far too much to say that. But you had a comment at the back? No? Okay. But that this is what we have here. We have a literary genre called an Imram, I-M-M-R-A-M, and it's a tale of seafaring adventures. And some of them, and this is one of them, involves sailing towards an island to the west on the edges of the map. And we'll see the edges of the map represented in this as well. They think they're going to go off the edge of the page. Why is that? Is it because they're benighted and they don't understand that the world's round and so forth? No, it's because he's mapping it onto the voyage of St. Brendan and how they saw it. It's not reflecting Lewis's flat earthism or something like that. Somebody might think that, who knows? No, it's because he's referring to that type of story. And it's really an ascetic, part of the ascetic tradition. So the monks who live celibate lives retreat into themselves to be closer to God. The voyage is basically doing that and adding a layer of devotion to it. So the purest of all the pure travel towards the west, away from the corruption of the flesh, away from the corruption of this world, in order to see God. That's the purpose of the voyage of the Dawn Treader, is it's mapping onto that. Does that make sense, at least? I mean, it makes sense in terms of what we see in the description as we go on, and then we meet this figure of Reepicheep in it. Did I mention Reepicheep before? I haven't mentioned Reepicheep before. How could I not mention the noble Reepicheep? We're reintroduced to Reepicheep here. How could I have neglected to do that? Anyway, Reepicheep is reintroduced here, and he's now presented as a noble figure, as a knight. You know, he was anyway. But he is the one that wants to, whose heart is so pure that he wants to see Aslan. So his moral virtue is not confined by a sense of knighthood that is secular and about just defeating your enemies. It's motivated by the Christian love of God, by faith, hope, and charity. He is, of all the beings of Narnia, the noblest, even though he's the smallest. Everyone loves Reepicheep. Great character to play if you're going to put on a play, to be Reepicheep. And his tail, and lots of, I'm not going to say anything too much about that. But that's the context here. And we go on the voyage and, as I say, meet with Prince Caspian. And Caspian has vowed to sail east towards the great Eastern Ocean for a year and a day to find the 7 lost lords of Narnia. And the 7 lost lords of Narnia, I'm going to say more about in a second. Do you have any comments or questions at this point before I get it further into the narrative and talk about some of its features? Yeah.
You're talking about like parallelism to the West, and going that direction. It seemed like in past tales what Lewis is drawing from, it's almost like they're trying to reach a bit of an escapism or escape the world, that they're after reach the land of paradise of God. It doesn't, like, while that is somewhat there in trying to reach the land of Aslan,
it is for sure.
It's there, but there seems to be more than just that idea of escapism. They're not trying to just escape Narnia. They're trying to explore the unknown.
But what it's doing, introducing for the first time, we don't see this up to this point, is the recognition that the realm of Narnia is just an image of the real Narnia. And there's a recognition that Narnia, for all of its delight, and maybe this is Lewis's retort to those that love Narnia more than Jesus. Remember, a schoolchild writes him and says that she loves Aslan more, and Lewis is horrified that he's leading a child astray in this. To some degree, he's answering what stories do is they give us, again, sort of signs of a world in which we've never lived yet. And all the good, true, beautiful things that we love about stories and take delight in this life are actually just foretastes of that. And he speaks about that in the essay that I've recommended to you a few times, The Weight of Glory. It says the ancient stories that he loves are actually just the beginnings, the glimmers, and just the opening sounds of a chorus that we've not yet heard in a company that we have not yet set foot amongst. But we get a foretaste of that in this life, in certain places, in church life, in familial life, and so forth, certain types of assemblies that help us mediate between the two great ills, sociologically speaking, of our day: individualism on the one hand and collectivism on the other. Individualism shorn of community, because in our day we get a lot of emphasis on the individual, and Britain becomes so strongly associated with individualism, and the US and so forth, but often it's presented as the individual fending for him or herself. And this is so it is said, the inheritance of the West is this great emphasis on individualism, which is true, by the way. Individualism is one of the legacies of the West that we don't find in other areas of the world or other religions, for that matter. There's no emphasis on the individual as the image bearer of God and the sanctity of that individual, etc. That's just not there. But individualism as individualism is devoid of the things that make life meaningful in many ways, which is the communal, the relational aspect of other people and with God. So the family, the church, those are not in individualism, and individualism to some degree despises the family, for which reason, as I've said, after the Romantics, the stereotypical hero is an orphan, repeatedly presented as an orphan without natural relations. So it's an individualism that gives way to the other great evil, which is collectivism, where everything is about communal identity and there are no individuals. So we vacillate between those two, between, if you want, between the right and the left, because the right emphasizes individual rights and the left represents collectivism, the group. And collectivism can come in either the fascist form or the communist form, but in both cases, the individual is irrelevant and can be sacrificed to the greater good, and the greater good's collective. In the conservative version, which is not conservative at all, the individualistic version, the greater good is the individual. A bare individual divorced of any other things that were essential for human existence, including their fathers and mothers. It leaves a sort of a social void. And one of the things that Lewis's Narnia Chronicles give to us is the importance of the group. It's very strong in Tolkien as well. Both of them talk about the hugely beneficial aspect of friendship, but also something like a community of faith. They're devoted to a common cause above and beyond themselves. Even if, as I said, Tolkien never uses the explicit religious language that Lewis does, it's implicit in the loves of the fellowship, here represented by Reepicheep. He longs, what makes him the noble mouse that he is that he serves Aslan and the Emperor over the Sea. That's what draws him. He's never seen the Emperor over the Sea, but he reveres him. He's a true believer. His heart is pure. He's like St. Brendan. He wants to go on this voyage, and he wants to go and not come back. So there's you could call it asceticism, but another way of presenting, and in the monastic tradition, it is sort of an asceticism, but you could also see it as a orientation towards heaven that Lewis is presenting as so delightful that it makes the children that read it long for that. And that's his intent as an author. We admire Reepicheep. Reepicheep loves this. I want to be like Reepicheep. It sets your soul in a different trajectory, something better, the undiscovered country to the east. It pulls you into a story. So when we meet this account in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the time lag between Caspian and this is 3 years. 3 years have been established since that past voyage, and Caspian is now taking a voyage that a quest, actually, not just a voyage, a quest in fulfillment of his coronation oath to sail east for a year and a day to find the 7 lost lords of Narnia. And their names are Aros and Bern and Mavramorn, Octesian, Restamar, Revilian, and Roop. And he leaves Trumpkin the dwarf in charge of Narnia as Lord Regent in his absence, which is sort of disastrous. Lucy and Edmund are delighted to be back there. Eustace is, to put it mildly, less enthusiastic. He's never been there, and also, and this is the worst of the worst, he taunted his cousins relentlessly about their imaginary world, and now he's there. So he's feeling humiliated, and he's angry and bitter and vindictive about it. And even though he's in the presence of a physical world, he won't believe in it. And so there's a little bit of a jibe at those people who claim to live by their senses and according to things that they can taste, touch, see, smell, whatever. Even in the presence of that world, will still deny it. Because again, what they're really denying isn't that world, it's the transcendent. That's their real hostility. It's not to reality. So they have a truncated view of what reality is. That's what they insist on living, and he'll repeatedly represent that. He'll represent in the Great Divorce. He will also represent it in the last battle when, remember, the dwarves get dragged into the tent and they are given this banquet and they taste rotting food. And they think they're being tricked and they refuse to go onwards. These are individuals who can't see They're presented the same way Scripture presents them, blind and deaf and dumb. And delightful things taste repugnant to them, taste like filth. So, but as they get on this, they meet, as I said, the talking mouse Reepicheep. Let's get back to this. To Reepicheep is also on board, and he has a different motive for getting on this trip. It's not to find the seven lords. He wants to find Aslan's country beyond the seas of the utter east. So there's the Brendan. And if you want, maybe Reepicheep is a sort of St. Brendan type character. He's along for the ride. And when Eustace teases Reepicheep, we see a great deal of the mouse's character revealed as well, and his willingness to fight over this in a wholly chivalric manner, but nonetheless a fight. He's willing to take on this giant comparative to him. And Eustace, for his part, finds the idea of physical combat utterly repugnant. You're a savage. And the huge irony there then is that we see that the savage is Eustace. He's a man without a chest. He's a man without any semblance of moral virtue, confronted by a mouse. Are you a man or a mouse? Well, the mouse is the man, and the man is the mouse in terms of character. My father used to say this to me when I was a boy. Are you a man or a mouse? Did anyone say that? No? Anyone say that anymore? No. Okay. And he'd say, squeak up. Hated that. At the same time, I sort of loved it and thought it was hilarious. Okay, so as they go, they make landfall in the Lone Islands. Now, this is nominally Narnian territory, but it's fallen away from Narnian ways. Well, what are the Narnian ways? Well, there's a slave trade that flourishes there. And this is interesting. So Narnia had abolished slavery, but now slavery is returned because they haven't been vigilant. Human nature is returning to the ways that contradict the rule of Aslan, even though there is a Narnian law stating that it's forbidden. And so Caspian, Lucy, Edmund, Eustace, and Reepicheep are captured as slaves, as chattel, by a slave trader, and a man buys Caspian before they even reach the slave market, and he turns out to be the first lost lord, whose name is Byrne, who had moved to the islands and married a woman there after being banished from Narnia by Miraz. The man who buys Caspian. Why does he buy Caspian? Of all the characters, why does he buy him? He looks like his father. He reminds him of him. He's going to redeem him from slavery. He bears the image of his father who had treated him well. And again, there's a lot you can make about bearing the image of the father. And so here it's restoring something right here by a simple act of charity, just buying one. Now note that Byrne has no power to fight, or isn't willing to take the fight to the evil forces there. And when Caspian reveals his identity, Lord Byrne acknowledges him as king right on the spot. And at that point, Caspian reclaims the islands for Narnia, and he replaces Gumpus, who's a greedy governor, with the Lord Byrne, and he calls him Duke of the Lone Islands. So he's restoring, and this is a political act, and it talks about legitimacy and what's the nature of legitimacy and what's the nature of humanity. Can you have slaves in a proper world? Lewis is making a commentary in Narnia about the world back where he lives. And this is characteristic, I would say, of sci-fi and fantasy literature in general. It is living in a fantastic, imaginative world, but it's always making a social commentary about this world. Always. So you have to read it on those levels as well. So now it has a political, social edge to it. Not only does it include mythological beasts, it also upholds the dignity of men, women, and children as image bearers of God. Therefore, there will be no slavery here. It's a Christianized world. It's not just a voyage. And he also declares, before he goes, that slavery is forbidden in all his dominions, and that all slaves immediately that he finds are free. So the voyage to find the 7 lost lords is simultaneously in search of the kingdom of God, if you will, the land where Aslan dwells, is bringing about that kingdom. So there's a social, political agenda that comes with the search for what's for God himself. If you really desire God's presence, wherever you go, you will make God's presence present. So there's the interesting thing. So it's a social, political, it's the relation of the 2 cities that we get from Augustine's City of God. There are 2 cities of this world. You live in the one, Toronto, and then there's the city of God in the midst of Toronto. And the presence of the city of God in the midst of the city is trying to make Toronto into Toronto the Good, which is, by the way, what it used to be called about 50, 60 years ago. It used to be called Toronto the Good, the city of churches. Nobody calls it that anymore. I wonder why. But for Christians in that city, they are traveling towards the undiscovered country of heaven, and on that voyage, they are bringing that heaven to them, praying, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," etc. So there's a political, sociological motivation for action there as well. Okay, so that's the first island. The second island they visit is one on which Eustace already revealed to us as a really selfish, chestless individual who denies the reality of the world in which he clearly is now involved, but he still thinks that it's some sort of trick and wants to be delivered over the British embassy and so forth, and claims he's been kidnapped and mistreated, and we know that he hasn't. But he's a liar and a bad character. But he leaves the group. Why? Because he doesn't want to work. That's it. He doesn't want to work. He thinks things should be provided for him by the state. Doesn't want to work to make the ship seaworthy after a storm has damaged it. And he leaves the group on his own little voyage, and he hides in a dead dragon's cave, as it turned out, to escape a downpour. There's a downpour. He goes inside just to escape the elements. And when he's there, he sees an enormous amount of treasure. Now, if he'd read any myths or stories, ancient stories, he would know that dragon's treasure is always cursed. Always. The gold that you find there is not gold that you can take. It is cursed. And it curses him, of course. But he fills his pockets with gold and jewels. He puts on a large golden bracelet, and as he sleeps, he's transformed into a dragon himself. And of course, the golden bracelet that fit his human arm doesn't fit his dragon flesh, and it's cutting into it. It's causing him enormous pain. And he doesn't even recognize what he's been transformed into as a consequence. Now, Lewis, again, it's not a portal narrative, but there is a sense of another world that's being represented physically, tangibly in the person of Eustace Scrubb. Perhaps it's to some degree showing an eschatological outcome to the pattern of life and the convictions that he has, which are purely earthly and purely carnal. You will end up being a dragon, cursed, and a curse to others. This is the outcome, the sort of teleological outcome, if you will, of being Eustace Scrubb, a man without a chest. You will eventually be a dragon, cursed, and you will hate yourself. You'll hate your life, and others will fear you. And in his new guise, he becomes aware. Now, this is the interesting thing. It's only when he is finally transformed into the form of a dragon, before whom he's also terrified. When he sees the image of the dragon, he hears the sound, he's looking around wondering where it is. It finally dawns on him that he is that dragon. And only at that point do the scales fall from his eyes. And he recognizes who he is and what a bad person he is, and he regrets it. Now, there's no need for that to have taken place, by the way, as part of the story. But that's what Lewis wants to do here, is to show how, and I think he talks about this in the play of Good and Evil and The Great Divorce and in other the four loves, talks about how distorted loves, when we're given over to them, actually make us realize that there's nothing but dust and ashes in those loves, and it actually brings us to repent, just like the problem of pain does. We think we want this, we get what we want, then we realize how deceptive and cruel that reality is, and then we repent of it, and part of that is a self-awareness which he lacked before and now has. So he sees that his previous behavior was very bad, and he tries to get the dragon skin off because he hates that aspect of himself now. It's not just that he is uncomfortable in it and that the bracelet now cuts into his flesh. That's not why he wants it off. He loathes himself as he was. So it's a sort of a conversion, or an awareness of sin at any rate, at the front end, and a contempt for it. He can't get rid of it, however. It's only when Aslan comes around that he's able to become human again, and a very painful process. He sticks his claws in him and rips. And he says the most painful thing that he ever suffered. Most painful thing he ever suffered. When he finally is shorn of that, it's a sort of a new birth then. He's born again. He's also transformed as a character from this point onward, of course. I've skipped over some of the aspects because, of course, he's the dragon that pulls the Dawn Treader away from the sea beast, which is another island, and serves good. This is part of his redemptive process. He's purging the sins through a sort of a moral works, trying to recover this. It does nothing in terms of changing him. He's still a dragon, right? Remember when they come along and they take his, and he pulls them away? He's still in the guise of the dragon. It's only when Aslan comes along and rips the dragon skin off of him that he's converted. Oh, it's only in the movie that they do that. Okay, well, I'm confusing the two. It's not after the fact. You're right. I've confused the two.
Same island he gets.
So what? Let's have a look at the movie. Why does the movie do this?
The movie keeps him a dragon much longer.
Yeah, why?
Artistic liberty.
Well, sure, of course, but the artistic liberty is to serve a certain purpose. Why would it serve that purpose? Can a dragon pull the company of the faithful in any good direction? As a dragon, can a dragon do that? It's impossible. If it has a Christological framework, if the land towards which they're going is heaven, it can't do it. I mean, evil can serve the purposes of good for sure, but he's no longer presented as evil. He wants to take them to a good thing. Not possible in the dragon's guise. So they've just, yes, it's artistic liberty, but it's bad artistic liberty. Like Lewis does it for a reason. You can't actually depart from the script on that in that fashion. You see what I mean? They do the same thing in the Lord of the Rings as well. They totally, what they do, the departures from the script, trash the intentions of the author and remove a lot of the purposiveness of every event. So it's fine to have artistic liberty. I have no particular problem with that, but it ought to match up. It's a very carefully architecturally structured work that if you're going to deviate, you better not take it off path. And it's because it's structured very carefully to fulfill that and to demonstrate there's a virtuous aim to the company here, and a dragon is not desiring that outcome. So when he has, you're right, he has the flesh torn off him by Aslan, and he repents, and he's a new character then. Now he's one of them. He's willing to work. He becomes admirable. And he and Reepicheep set aside their enmity at that point as well. Reepicheep was always willing to do it, but now Eustace is as well, because he recognizes what a nasty little brute he is. And Reepicheep, being the gracious, chivalric mouse that he is, immediately forgives him. Nothing more, never says anything more about it. And the company that he keeps then, Eustace, is part of his maturation as a character. Just like Lucy and Edmund also grow in virtuous character by the company that they keep. Same with Eustace. So Eustace then becomes a very admirable character in the same way that Edmund did. And he's a foil for Edmund, in the sense that the two were really bad characters that betrayed their friends or families, who then become almost leading figures in the amongst the Narnians. Admirable. The greatest accomplishments to some degree are associated with them. So, but that bracelet on his arm is recognized by Caspian as belonging to the Lord Actesian, another of the lost lords, and then we find out what happened to him. And they speculate. The dragon killed Octesian, or even the dragon was Octesian that expired when it passed over to him. We don't know. But he he failed his test, in a sense. He got lost along the way. So Aslan turns Eustace back into a boy, and he is now a much more agreeable individual. It's night and day. You would not recognize Eustace. Next, the crew go on, and they escape being sunk by a sea serpent, and they stop at Deathwater Island, another very interesting place. Why is it named so? Well, a pool of water turns everything immersed into gold. Again, the gold metaphor. It's cursed. They're after a gold that is not a physical gold. It's a representation of the sun, which is, again, a representation of a spiritual life. And one of another one of the lords, Restamar, has perished there. Restamar in the sea. He dives down and is turned into gold himself. Then they go on to the Duffer's Island, where we meet these strange characters called Dufflepuds, one-footed creatures that think they're beautiful, and everyone else thinks it's ridiculous. It's an island where there's an invisibility spell, where he meets a magician, the magician that casts the spell. Now, the magician casts the spell. Why does he do this? The magician here is a good magician, by the way. And not all magic in Lewis's works is presented as, it depends on the purpose and intent of the magician or the teacher, because the two are almost always going together, is to keep the poor Dufflepuds, who are prone to, first of all, enormous pride of their appearance, from doing very foolish things. So he's governing very foolish people or creatures for their own good, and they're so pathetic that they would undo everything he did if he didn't make them invisible. Next, they reach the island where dreams come true. And this is one of the most threatening of all the islands. This is one that sort of terrifies me. The island where dreams come true, called the Dark Island, because it's permanently hidden in darkness. The dreams that come true are not necessarily good dreams. They're whatever dream comes into your head when you first come there. And Lord Roop, whom they rescue there, has been tormented for years by his nightmares, because that was the first thing that popped into his head. He had a certain dream that was a nightmare, and he had to live in it. So he's isolated on an island. Lewis is commenting on the character of dreams. Then go back to the discarded image and what it talks about, the dream of Scipio. There are different types of dreams. All dreams are not good. Some are good, some hold true, some are totally fictitious, some are given by evil spirits even. This is the sort of dreams in general. All sorts of dreams are possible. Lord Roop had a nightmare vision, and he is lost and caught in nightmares, and that when they find him, he's a broken man spiritually. He's terrorized. They can't even take him with him because he's so, his mental health is broken. He's a pathetic shell of a man. And so out of compassion, they deliver him from his nightmare. And eventually they reach the island of the star, where they find the three remaining lost lords in enchanted sleep. Now, the three remaining lost lords are, as I say, sleep at a banquet table. And it's a banquet table that they don't participate in, nonetheless. And there on the island of the star, we find the presence of a supernatural being getting very much closer to the end of the world now. The host's name is Ramandu, a fallen star who lives there with his daughter, who tells them that the only way you're going to awaken these three sleeping lords is to voyage to the edge of the world and leave one member of the crew behind. One, and only one. Lord Roop wishes to sleep without dreams beside his friends. Of course he does. Because for him, dreams are nightmares. If I can sleep without having dreams, which are for me nightmares, I want that sleep. Is it a commentary on mental health and dealing with? I think there is something of there. There's a rest and restoration aspect of that, which again, sleep is a gift of God that restores us. It's a sort of a picture of restoration, just like food is a picture of nourishment, nutrition, restoration, and so forth, and feasting and eating. But he wants to sleep beside his friends until they wake, and everyone agrees before they set out again, and they go onwards. Now, as they go onward, there's only one of them can stay behind. That's the price for waking these three. There then emerges a debate between two figures over who will stay behind. Caspian, who always wants to be noble and wants to then go in that country, and Reepicheep. And a really interesting exchange between those two figures then over who ought to stay behind. And all of the company agrees that it ought not to be Caspian. And Caspian is annoyed, to put it mildly. Again, he feels slighted. Remember, he wants to be noble. He's acquainted with the nature of his station in life, which is that of duty. Your vocation is not to do things for yourself. It is not the monastic vocation. It is not the life of asceticism. It's the life of governance over your people. It is wrong for you to lay down your charge, which has been given you by Aslan, to do this thing. So it's a political office. And again, if you want to see parallels between this, you could look at things like The Tempest, where Prospero wanted to live a monastic life, a devoted life, a life of knowledge and wisdom and so forth, and neglected his political duties, and his brother usurped him, etc. But he's the point for in The Tempest and here is that princes are given their role by God for the service of others. And if you really did serve Aslan, you will not go directly to him. You will do your duty. Stay behind and do your duty. That's what Reepicheep calls him to do. And eventually, he relents. But not quickly. It takes a great deal and a potential, not quite a mutiny, but certainly a fight there. And then Reepicheep jumps in the water, sees the mermen coming towards him, of course wants to fight them, being Reepicheep. And the water gets more and more shallow and brighter as they move onwards. And oh yeah, about that story. Nothing persuades Caspian that he ought not to go. The individuals cannot persuade him. Aslan comes to him in his cabin and tells him. Direct revelation. That's the only thing that changes his mind. It says only Lucy, Edmund, Eustace, and Reepicheep will go on. So they go through a sea of lilies, and then they reach this wall of water that goes up at the end of the world and into the sky. And Reepicheep paddles his coracle up the waterfall, and he goes up, and we never see him again until we get to Narnia. And Aslan tells Edmund and Lucy they're not going back to Narnia either, just like their brother and sister. But Eustace is different. When Lucy is despondent about the fact that she's not going to be allowed to return here, Aslan tells the children that he exists in their world too. So if you think that I only exist here, you're wrong. I exist back in your world. So again, the intersection is not two totally separate places, one real, one's imaginary. There's an overlap there. If you want me in your world, you have to acknowledge me. I have a different name in your world. You will know me by that name. It's not Aslan. So again, it becomes more Christological, explicitly so. He presents himself as a lamb, as I said, in speaking to them. They don't recognize him. They expect him to be a lion. Well, now they get the character of the lamb, which is to be a sacrificial and in some ways a weak character, not recognized for his strength by the world. He says, but in their world, there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there. And then the three children get sent home. And everyone remarks when they go back home how much Eustace has changed. Not the other two, because the other two were already those sorts, but Eustace now. And they're sent back then to recognize what the other name. Now, Lewis is becoming more and more explicitly apologetic now. You have to know me by that name. It's not there in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but it is now, at the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. As I say, Lucy and Edmund will part company now. We won't see them again until towards the end of the last battle. We will have Eustace, however. We'll pick him up next time in the silver chair with another figure. And they just happen to be in and around a school. And we'll talk more about that at that point. Okay? But that's it for today. Yes?